Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Change the outcome of that. There is some ambiguity about what effect, if any, Russia might have had in the Brexit referendum. And I think Downing Street will stick quite firmly to the line that there is no evidence to suggest that Russia successfully swayed the outcome of that. I mean, you know, let's not forget that the incumbents in Downing Street at the moment were central to that Brexit campaign. There will be elements as well about Russian money that has come into the UK, describing London as a laundromat, if you like, for Russian money to come into the UK, both to try and influence, but also to try and hide it from other influences. And there'll be suggestions that legislation should be brought forward in order to try and deal with that. I think the other recommendation that will come out of it is that there needs to be a much more centralised governmental approach and strategy towards Russia. For too long, it has been different departments or different intelligence agencies pursuing their own strategy towards Russia, but there should be something much more centralised, if you like.
Alistair, the publication is going to take the form of a news conference led by the new chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee, Julian Lewis, who, of course, until he had the whip taken away last week, was a Conservative MP, now independent, flanked by some other opposition members of that committee. And there is the suggestion, and there we are, there is Julian Lewis.
As chairman of the committee, I'm hosting the event. However, I shall not be speaking to the report itself. The inquiry and report were ably conducted by my predecessor, the Right Honourable Dominic Grieve, and the members of his committee. I myself am not in a position to discuss the report or its contents. I am, however, delighted to be joined by two members of the current committee who also served on the previous committee. Kevin Jones and Stuart Hosey both worked on the Russia inquiry and produced this report. They will make a statement now about the report explaining its findings and are then happy to answer any questions you may have. Kevin, over to you.
Thank you, Julian, and good morning to everybody. This report is a result of extensive inquiries by the previous committee on which both Stuart Hosey and myself sat. Can I also take the opportunity to thank Dominic Greaves, the chair of that committee, for his work, and also the former members that also served on the committee. Could I also thank the agencies and civil servants for their input into this report, and also thank the open source commentators and academics that also contributed to the report. Under the Justice and Security Act, the committee must send its report to the Prime Minister for confirmation that they can be published. As has been widely reported, the Prime Minister failed to provide his confirmation that this report could be published within the standard 10 working days. And as a result, the House rose for the general election before the report could be published. There was no reason for this delay. Number 10 have said that there are only 6 days in which to look at this report. That is not true. The Prime Minister has also said, office has also said that it usually takes 6 weeks to actually get this confirmation. Can I also say that's categorically not true? The number 10 has also reported that it also had to go back around government for comment. Again, this is not true. It had already been through the processes. The final point was said that the proper processes hadn't been followed in the consideration of this report. Can I also say that categorically is not true? Everyone who needed to see the report in government had done so. It was now waiting for the Prime Minister to agree the report, which was sent to him on the 17th of October. The Prime Minister finally provided confirmation the day after the election, having taken a record time in doing so. However, the report can only be laid by the committee So we had to wait 7 months for the committee to be constituted, again, a record period of time. The committee met last week to agree unanimously the report would be published before the House rose for the summer recess. And I'm pleased the report has therefore finally been published today, 9 months after it was completed. There has been some attempt to discredit the report by suggesting that the 9-month delay means that the report is now stale and out of date. You'll see very clearly yourselves today, this is not the case. The delay by the Prime Minister inevitably fueled a great deal of speculation as to why and what the report might say, in particular around the EU referendum. That is why Stuart and I thought it was important to talk about the report, to tell you the key findings and to address the speculation that has taken place over the last 9 months. Can I now hand over to Stuart?
Thank you, Kevin. Let me start by saying that the UK is one of Russia's top Western intelligence targets. We know that Russia targets the UK, and not just to steal secrets or research. It suits Russia if there is disunity in the West. It weaponizes information. Russia's intelligence services are disproportionately large and powerful, and they can act with little constraint. And the fusion between state, business, and serious and organized crime in Russia gives them further weight and leverage. Russia poses an all-encompassing security threat, which is fueled by paranoia about the West and a desire to be seen as a resurgent great power. It carries out malicious cyber activity in order to assert itself aggressively, for example, by attempting to interfere in other countries' elections and by pre-positioning itself on other countries' critical national infrastructure, and this is an immediate threat to national security. Which is why we were concerned during our inquiry to find out there is no clear coordination of the numerous organisations across the UK intelligence community who are working on this issue, and that there is a bizarrely complicated wiring diagram of responsibilities amongst ministers for no good reason. We need a simpler chain of command. We've seen that the government is now taking an assertive approach when it comes to identifying and laying blame on the perpetrators of cyber attacks, and we do welcome this. And the UK should encourage other countries to adopt a similar approach to naming and shaming. We should also be working with our allies to develop an international doctrine on the use of offensive cyber. Kevin.
Russia promotes disinformation and attempts to influence overseas, whether that's through social media, hack and leak, or using its state-owned traditional media, as being widely reported. The UK is clearly a target and must equip itself to counter such effort. Our paper-based voting and counting system makes actual interference with the mechanism difficult. The focus instead is on attempts to influence voters before they cast their votes by spreading disinformation and creating discord by amplifying existing differences. So the question is who is protecting the British public from interference in our democratic process? Well, in a nutshell, we found no one is. We found the defence of the UK's democratic process is a hot potato. No one was prepared to accept their overall lead. Now we now do understand that there is a considerable nervousness about the security intelligence agencies getting involved in the mechanics of a democratic process, and that's rightly so. But we're also talking about here about the protection of the process. DCMS and the Electoral Commission simply do not have the weight and access required to tackle a major hostile state threat. Democracy is integral to our country's success and well-being. Protecting it must be a ministerial priority. with the Office of Security and Counter-Terrorism taking the policy lead and the operational role sitting with MI5. This needs to be gripped now. The government must also ensure that social media companies who have failed to play their part to take down the use of their platforms by hostile states. We need clear deadlines within which material will be removed, and government need to name and shame those who fail to do so. Can I now hand over back to Stuart?
This lack of interest in responsibility is important because it translates directly across in terms of investigation into and action against interference. And we saw that when we looked into allegations that Russia sought to influence voters in the 2016 referendum on the UK's membership of the European Union. Studies have pointed to the preponderance of pro-Brexit or anti-EU stories on RT and Sputnik and the use of bots and trolls. The actual impact of such attempts on the result itself, by which I mean did the disinformation actually change how people voted, would be difficult, if not impossible, to prove. There has, however, been speculation that this report was going to reveal either that Russia had interfered in or sought to influence the referendum. In the committee's view, it's worse than that. The report reveals that no one in government knew if Russia interfered in or sought to influence the referendum because they did not want to know. The UK government have actively avoided looking for evidence that Russia interfered. We were told that they hadn't seen any evidence, but that is meaningless if they hadn't looked for it. The committee found it astonishing that no one in government had sought beforehand to protect the referendum from such attempts or investigated afterwards what attempts to influence it there may have been. The government, the UK government, should have recognised the threat back in 2014 in relation to the Scottish referendum, but it didn't. It didn't understand the threat until after the hack and leak operation against the Democratic National Committee in the United States. And because it was too slow to recognise the threat, it didn't take action to protect the UK in 2016. One would have thought that once the existence of that threat had been understood, seeing what had happened in the US, that someone here would have wanted to understand the extent and nature of the threat to the UK, and we wanted to see the post-referendum assessment. But there isn't one. There has been no assessment of Russian interference in the EU referendum, and this goes back to nobody wanting to touch this issue with a 10-foot pole. This is in stark contrast to the US response to reports of interference in the 2016 presidential elections. No matter how politically awkward or potentially embarrassing, there should have been an assessment of Russian interference in the EU referendum, and there must now be one. And the public must be told the results of that assessment. We heard last week the government disclosed details of attempts to influence the 2019 election. And there was considerable suspicion about the timing of that announcement and whether it was designed to draw the sting from this report. I cannot see anything that would draw the sting from this report. I will say that it's good that work now appears to be being done to investigate attempts to interfere in the UK's democratic process, although the committee, the new committee, will reserve judgment as it has yet to receive the underlying intelligence. But it is all rather too late. They should have done this in respect of previous democratic processes. And we must not let what has happened recently deflect attention from the retrospective work which does need to be done to investigate previous attempts. Now, coming back to Kevin Jones' comments about the delay in publication and speculation as to why that was, the previous chair said he thought that the British public should have been able to see the report before the election. And I agree. The public was allowed to go into that election without knowing that the government had not sought to investigate whether hostile states had been interfering in UK democratic processes. And I find that shocking. Kevin.
You, Stuart. The outrage isn't that there was interference. The outrage is that no one has wanted to know if there was interference. And that, I think, comes through very loud and clear in our report. What we do know about Russian influence in the UK is that it's the new normal. Successive governments have welcomed Russian oligarchs and their money with open arms. And there is a lot of Russians with very close links to Putin who are now very well integrated into both UK business, political and social scene in what has been referred to as Londongrad. Yet few, if any, questions have been asked regarding the provenance of considerable wealth. This open door approach has provided an ideal mechanism by which illicit finance could be recycled through the London laundromat. And it is not just the oligarchs either. The arrival of Russian money has resulted in a growth industry of enablers. Lawyers, accountants, estate agents have all played a role, wittingly or unwittingly, and formed a buffer of Westerners who are de facto agents of the Russian state. There is an obvious inherent tension between the government's posterity agenda and the need to protect national security. To a certain extent, this cannot be untangled. The priority now must be to mitigate the risk and ensure that where hostile activity is uncovered, that proper tools exist to tackle it at its source and to challenge it. Stuart.
It is notable, for example, that a number of members of the House of Lords have business interests linked to Russia or work directly for major Russian companies linked to the Russian state. These relationships should be carefully scrutinized, given the potential for the Russian state to exploit them. There must be complete transparency about any links with Russian businesses at every level of politics. And we do not have that in respect of the House of Lords at present. Now, that is all I'm going to say about what's in the published report. There is, of course, a classified annex, but we cannot reveal details in that report without revealing information which could be harmful to the UK. On the other side of the coin, in addition to Putin-linked elites, the UK is also home to a number of Putin's critics who have sought sanctuary here, fearing politically motivated charges and harassment. Now, the events of the 4th of March 2018 showed the vulnerability of former Russian intelligence officers who have settled in the UK, and this is one of the issues we do address in the classified annex to the report. What we can say is that it's been clear for some time that Russia under Putin is an established threat, fundamentally unwilling to adhere to international law. The murder of Alexander Litvinenko in 2006 and annexation of Crimea in 2014 are stark indicators of this. But in our opinion, the UK government took its eye off the ball because of its focus on counter-terrorism. The government had badly underestimated the response required to the Russian threat and is still playing catch-up. Russia poses a tough intelligence challenge, and the agencies here must have the tools they need to tackle it. The Official Secrets Act, for example, is simply not fit for purpose when it comes to tackling foreign spies. And until we change that, the intelligence community's hands are tied. Kevin.
Just one final point, and that is the need for international consensus against Russian action. To constrain their nefarious activities will rely on making the price to Russia that they extract sufficiently high that they will change, hopefully, their actions. The West is strong when it acts collectively together, and the UK needs to take a leading role in that. The expulsion of 153 diplomats from 29 countries and NATO following the US chemical weapons attack in Salisbury was unprecedented. Together with the subsequent exposure of GRU agents responsible, this sent a clear and strong message that actions would not be tolerated. We must build on that momentum, and that momentum must not be lost.
So we're now ready to take some questions, and I have a list so far of 10 people, and the first will be Laura Koonsberg from the BBC.
Thanks very much, Chairman. They simply dropped the ball in terms of looking for political interference. And who do you hold responsible for the failure to look for evidence of what was really going on?
Would like to take that, Stuart.
Laura, I wouldn't want to say that the UK government deliberately avoided asking the questions, but nevertheless, they did avoid asking the questions. And the real criticism is that after the Scottish referendum in 2014, after the DNC hack and leak episode in 2016, it must have been clear that had they looked for similar evidence in the UK, as the report said, it would have been extraordinary if they hadn't reached the same conclusions. So I'm not going to say this was a deliberate act of omission, but an act of omission it was nevertheless, and it's left the UK vulnerable because we do not yet know the scale and scope of the interference.
Can I just add to that, is the security and defence, I think, of not only our democracy but our people should be the first role of government. The government here have clearly let us down because, as Stuart has outlined, it wasn't that this was some type of wild fishing expedition you'd be going on. There was clear evidence, not only just from the Scottish referendum, but also the democratic leak in the United States. And so a serious question needs to be asked why ministers didn't then see that they should at least look at the level of Russian interference in those elections. It's remarkable to me that suddenly last Thursday we had a statement saying or claiming that Russia had interfered in the 2019 general election, but complete silence on what went on before.
Guidance of journalists, because of the numbers and the anticipated time of finishing, I'm allowing about 4 minutes per journalist back and forth. So Laura, would you like to come back again? Can't hear you.
Yes, thank you very much. In taking the evidence subject, were reasons given to you by any of your witnesses as to why these investigations had not taken place?
The reasons appear to be a complete lack of clarity as to who should instruct it or whether it should be self-tasked. And as we describe in the report, a complete hot potato. Nobody wanted to take responsibility for this. Now, as Kevin Jones pointed out earlier, there's understandable nervousness about intelligence agencies being engaged in the democratic process. But as the report makes clear, that doesn't mean they shouldn't be protecting the democratic process. So what we're saying now is there needs to be clarity from government that this assessment needs to be undertaken, whether that's tasked directly by government or whether one of the agencies, MI5, self-tasks to do this work.
The written evidence, because we as a committee look at evidence, the evidence which the government provided said they had not seen any successful interference in the UK democratic process or any activities that has led to impact on elections, for example, influence results. However, the scandal is the reason for that is because no one had actually sought that, and there was no investigation. So they can make that statement without any but no attempt was made to look at it. So it's a pretty hollow statement.
Squeeze one more in if you've got it. Laura? Would you like to ask one more question? Can't hear you. Obviously, obviously spooks are causing problems here.
There we go.
There we go.
Finally, thank you. There's a problem with the mute button. Thanks very much. Just to Mr. Jones, can I just ask you to clarify further? You've accused the Prime Minister of misleading people around the process of the publication of this report. Are you saying he's lied about why it should be published?
You have to ask the Prime Minister that. All I was setting out was the various statements that have been made, not possibly by the Prime Minister, but by number 10, which were categorically not true. And, you know, they are facts. And it's, you know, I know there's a new thing that if number 10 says something, it's got to be true. Unfortunately, on this occasion, it clearly wasn't. I think I listed at least 4 occasions, which all four statements made by number 10 can be refuted.
Thank you very much, Laura. So the next person on my list is Deborah Haynes. Deborah.
Thank you. I hope you can you hear me?
Yes, you're perfectly.
Thank you very much. You've obviously sort of set out this failure to this lack of curiosity in the threats to our democratic processes. While obviously ministers have questions to answer about that, do you also think that the spy chiefs, the spy masters who are in charge of the agencies should have been more forceful in gripping what you describe as a hot potato and getting to the bottom of whether or not there was actually Russian interference in the Brexit referendum?
Primarily, this is a political question. Should the government have instructed this work to be undertaken? And the answer is yes, of course it should have. As to the question about heads of agencies, only MI5 can self-task and direct work itself. The other agencies would require to be asked to do it. So yes, MI5 perhaps should have done this work, but more importantly, and I think you led it off very cleverly, the lack of curiosity, particularly after the DNC hack and leak episode. One would have assumed someone at the heart of government might have wanted to know if the efficacy of democratic processes in the UK was being undermined, if discordant messages were being amplified, if there was an attempt to actually change the result. That work has not been done.
I think there's quite rightly, I think, in our democracy, a reluctance for the security service to directly get involved in the political process. I think that's a given. But I think what is not excusable here, as Stuart has just outlined, that no one in government, in terms of ministerial level or above, actually looked at the flashing lights that were there already in terms of the Scottish referendum and the issue in terms of the Democratic Party in the United States. And that is a political question, and that is one that should have been looked at. And in terms of failures, that is a major failure because we say in the report, if we discovered, for example, interference, could we have quantified its effect on elections? No, we couldn't. I don't think you could. But at least I think we could have actually known what the threat was, but also measures in the future we could take to mitigate against those threats.
Deborah, have another go.
Thank you. Obviously, you can't say categorically whether or not there was Russian interference in the Brexit referendum, but given all the evidence that you have heard, what is your best guess? Do you believe that Russia did try to influence that vote? And just a second follow-up, if I may. You talked about how that standard government line that we've heard so many times, that there's been no evidence of successful interference. Do you believe that that was the government being deliberately evasive to avoid the fact that they just simply don't know because they haven't looked?
Well, I'm not sure if it was being evasive or if it was trying to just be a little too cute. And as Kevin said, it would be impossible to quantify the impact of interference. So in the sense that it's impossible to prove whether that interference had been successful or otherwise. The key point, though, and you allude to it in your question, they hadn't asked that question, and that's at the heart of this report.
Deborah, I think the question is this, and I think there's obviously a misunderstanding of the role of this committee. We deal with evidence. We have extensive powers, including access to some of the most highly classified and secret material that is available to government. There was no evidence that we saw, and the reason why there was no evidence, because no one had actually asked for the work to be done. So in terms of saying, did Russia interfere in the EU referendum, you can't say that, but no one in government asked that either. So on the evidence we saw, I think we came to the conclusion that we can't make a judgment call, and Stuart's right, even if there had been an investigation into it, quantifying the effect of that actually on the result would be very difficult. But we saw no evidence because there was no evidence, and no one in government sought to look or ask the questions that needed to be asked.
One more, Deborah?
Well, I mean, given that that's your finding, are you now going to, are you demanding that they do go and look and find out? And will you, as a committee, be following up this inquiry and investigating and finding out conclusively whether or not Russia did influence in our democratic events like the referendum?
Well, we cannot ask the agencies to do work. We can only ask them to tell us what they already know. But it's self-evident from the publication of this report that the government should now sit up and pay attention, and we have welcomed, as I said, the work that they appear to have done in relation to 2019, but we've yet to see the evidence of that. What we've also said is that the committee will now look at any evidence which comes forward in relation to what's happened 2019 and beyond. But we would also agree, and it's in the report, with the DCMS Select Committee, which has made a similar request to government in the past, that it should try to understand the scale and nature of the interference in previous electoral and democratic events.
What I would say is this, is we had a written ministerial statement last week suggesting that, from the Foreign Secretary, suggesting that Russia had interfered in the 2019 general election. We have seen no evidence of that because we've not been provided with any of the intelligence which supports that statement. We've asked to see it. But the important point here, I think, is that in terms of the protecting a democratic process, lessons should have been learned, or at least the question should have been asked, and they weren't. So if, and the report is very clear, we suggest government should now do it. But as Stuart said, we can't task the agencies or anyone else to undertake this review.
Thank you, Kevin. We now come to Andy Bell of 5 News.
Authorities simply didn't ask the questions, but you must be able to point to something. What is the worst example you can give of Russian interference in our democratic process? What is the worst thing they've done as far as you know?
Well, that's the question which we want to have answered. Now, the UK government, in their written ministerial statement last week, pointed, I think they say in their statement, there was an extensive assessment and there was the leaking of what's described as illicitly acquired material in relation to the UK-US trade deals. It was posted, I understand, on Reddit. The UK government say it didn't gain traction, but it was clearly being put out there, according to the UK government, in order to interfere directly in a UK election. Now, I'm not going to say that's the worst that's happened because, and this is the whole point, Andy, and it's alluded to in your question directly, we don't know because no assessment of previous electoral events was undertaken or requested, and that's absolutely shocking given what we do know about Russian interference, particularly the hack and leak operation at the Democratic National Committee in the United States.
Andy, I think a lot of it is, I think, being on open source, some of the things you're suggesting about. But what is actually, it did shock me that the government have not actually looked at this this area. And as Stuart's just said, there was evidence from the it wasn't during the Scottish referendum, it was the post result. There's clear evidence in the United States. The United States took it serious enough to actually investigate it. There was hack and leaks in terms of the French elections as well. So there was a lot of evidence that Russia were doing this to some of our closest allies, but government has thought that it wasn't necessary to look in terms of how it affected those elections. And Stuart has highlighted the issue of the statement last week. Now, some cynics might say it was convenient to perhaps draw the thorns from this report. But if you look at the statement, I don't think it says that Russia actually did the original leaking of the. What it said it would amplify it, but we can't comment on that from an intelligence point of view because we have not seen the intelligence that underlies that. We've asked for it, so until we've actually seen the intelligence that underlies that statement, we're just taking the statement as it's been produced.
Further question, Andy?
Yeah, one more quick one. I mean, do you have any faith that now the UK government is taking this seriously and in similar situations would now be asking the questions that you say weren't asked in the past?
Yes, because this is the first time I can imagine for a very long time that these sorts of matters are being discussed widely in the media and in the public. I mean, today and last week we've had 2 written ministerial statements on this sort of subject with the publication of this report today. I think there's an understanding now of the way state and non-state operators behave, trying to influence people's opinion and the results of elections, bots and trolls all over the place. I think this will now become part of the firmament of political discussion and media discussion, how we stamp it out, how we stop the disinformation, how we protect the democratic processes from malign state involvement or engagement or interference. So yes, I do hope this is a start of a watershed in making sure everything we do is clean, or as clean as it can be, from outside interference.
Andy, we have time for a quick last one if you have a third question.
Okay, right, let's move on. Luke Harding of The
Guardian.
I wonder if I could clarify whether the committee looked at interactions between Leave EU and Aaron Banks and the Russian ambassador in London, Alexander Yakovenko, in the months before the EU referendum in late 2015 and late 2016. Is this something you looked at? Because he says that he's exonerated by your report.
All I can say is that the only reference to it is, I think, on page 50. Sorry, is footnote 50 on page 13 in the report.
Do you want to have a follow-up, Luke?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't really understand that. The audio was very poor. Might you repeat that, please, Mr. Jones?
Yeah, sorry about that, Luke. It is referred to in the report, but it's referred to, if you look on page 13, footnote 50 covers Mr. Aaron Banks.
If I might follow up, just to be clear, are you now saying that Downing Street and the security agencies should launch a comprehensive investigation into Russian interference around the 2016 referendum? Is that one of your messages today?
Yes, self-evidently. We need to understand, the UK government needs to understand, what interference there may have been, whether it had any impact on influencing the result or not least to ensure that future political events, future electoral processes can be protected from similar interference.
And sorry, just lastly. Sorry.
The clear line is yes, we do, because it's not just about looking historically at what happened or didn't happen, but it's actually making sure that we can have the integrity going forward, knowing the threat, putting in policy place that protect the democratic process. And I think, in a democracy, that is very important in terms of that people have confidence that the process is robust as possible and is protected. But if you haven't even looked at the process in the past, I'm not sure how you can protect in the future. So yes, we want the government now to look, but as I said earlier on, we have no powers to instruct government or agencies to do that.
Luke, do you want to follow up further?
Yeah. Just last question. I can imagine what the Prime Minister's response will be. I suspect he'll be extremely reluctant to investigate this. Is there anything further you might say to persuade him that actually this isn't about party political advantage, but this is about the integrity of British democratic processes?
This is not about party politics. It's above that. It's actually about making sure that our political process is as secure as possible, that people have faith that their vote counts. And it is important, and I would say this very clearly, is that, and I know a lot of accusations being made about the past chair of and the personalities on the committee that drew up this report. That wasn't the main. That was nothing to do with it at all. It was to actually ensure that we actually looked at Russian interference in the political system. And if we are going to have integrity of the system going forward, we need to, one, see if there's a threat, but also, more importantly, learn lessons and see if there are things we need to change, for example, to ensure that that electoral system is secure. Because democracy at the end of the day is very precious.
Thank you, Kevin. So we'll now move on to Sam Lister of The Express.
Hello. Yes, I wonder if you can just be very explicit, please, about why you think the government doesn't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole. Is it money? Is it politics? Is it that our intelligence and security agencies just don't have the capability to get a grip on this?
It certainly is not the latter. The intelligence agencies most certainly have the ability to get a grip of this. They need to be tasked or choose to task themselves to do it. As to why the government won't touch this, perhaps that's a question you might want to ask them, because one would have imagined whichever party or parties were in government at any given time, the one thing they would want to ensure was the robustness and security and efficacy and trust in the electoral process. So it is beyond this committee to understand why there has been such an omission and that information on potential interference was never requested. As to why they wouldn't want to do it in the future, well, let's hope those opinions or minds have changed and they'll now take this matter more seriously.
Yes, please. I just wonder if I could touch on an issue Mr. Hosey raised earlier about the House of Lords and the lack of transparency there. This morning, Bill Browder, who gave evidence to this investigation, said that he'd handed over names and evidence about Conservative and Labour peers who take money from oligarchs to do their bidding. Do you think there is any evidence of criminal matters in relation to that? And should there be an investigation into the activities in the Lords and kind of overhaul?
Well, there's two things. I won't comment on the specific allegation, and I don't know what information was handed over to whom. Obviously, if it's alleged criminality, that's a matter for the police. But what we're saying is that in the House of Commons, for example, every earning over £100 has to be declared. That does not exist in the House of Lords. Even that little thing, that absence of obvious transparency, needs to be addressed, and we believe, because of the potential for people or for the Russian state to try to use people, the more transparency we can have and the quicker we can have it, the better. So at the most basic level, let's have those who are employed by directly or do work for indirectly, oligarchs or companies linked to the Russian state, are at the very least declaring their income from that in the same way that members of parliament have to do. That strikes me as a sensible, modern, transparent, common sense thing to do. And there's no reason why that cannot be done quickly.
I agree with what Stuart's just said. In terms of the names you're suggesting, I'm not aware of who they are. Did we choose to name people in this report produced today? No, we did not. And you know, the redactions were agreed with the entire committee and also the security service as well. Names were mentioned at the committee, and I don't think I wish to comment on those that are not in the open report.
One more follow-up, please.
Well, just do you think anybody had questionable behaviour? Do you think there were questions about that behaviour, even if you can't name them? And just more generally, if you've talked about how the government is playing catch-up now and must take action, what are the top 3 priorities you feel that the government must now look at to rectify this issue?
Well, there are many things it could do. But if you want 3, let's start with investigate thoroughly whether there has been interference historically. Let's do the transparency on the House of Lords. And of course, there's so much more in this report than the rather narrow scope we've spoken about so far. There's a revamp needed of the Official Secrets Act. It is not illegal to be a foreign agent in the UK today. It's not illegal to spy. It's only illegal once you pass information over. That surely can't be right. So there's 3 off the top of my head. There are many more.
Yeah, individuals need to take responsibility for their own actions in terms of how they operate, but I'm not going to comment on names in terms of that you referred to. There is an access report which we will not comment on because of the nature of the material in that for national security reasons. In terms of if there is criminality, that, as Stuart said, is a matter for the police. But the best issue here is transparency, so we know what people's connections are, what they're doing. And I think that would be important. For those individuals on the list you refer to, I think it's for them to comment on why, what their actions are, not this committee.
Thank you very much, Sam. We now move to Larissa from the Daily Mail.
Thank you. There's obviously been a huge delay to the publication of this, as you've set out. I'm just wondering, what do you think the impact of that has been? Could lessons have been learned for the last general election? And also, just on the section on cyber attacks, you obviously detail how Russia have carried out cyber attacks against, or attempted cyber attacks against the FCO. What do you think the UK has sufficient tools to combat cyber? Have we been doing enough in this domain? Thank you.
The reason for the delay is the government delayed this report. I don't think, and I think we've spent the last certain week trying to discredit it by saying that there's nothing in it or it's out of date. And I think if you read it, it clearly isn't. It's clearly very relevant. And I think that is important. The motivations for that are obviously for government and the Prime Minister to answer it. But what I want to just reiterate this point is, and I did lay out the 4 points when I opened this press conference, the reasons put up by the government for the delay are just not true. So they need to answer that. And I think, I'll leave that there. In terms of cyber, I think it's well documented in open source.
The delay impact of because of the delay, rather than the sort of reasons?
I think, as the previous chairman said earlier this week, is that this should have been produced before the 2019 general election. It's then for the public to make a judgment on that. It was delayed because of government, not because of this committee. What I think has saddened me a little bit in the last couple of weeks, and certainly the last 24 hours, is a way of trying to diminish the impact of this report. We do a serious job for this country in terms of oversight of our security. That's an important point of our part of our democracy. And I think the way in which the government have tried to politicise this, but also I think tried to to more or less push this report aside, doesn't help in terms of the important role that this committee and Parliament has in terms of scrutinising, scrutinising our democracy. Because if we are going to have faith in our security services, and we have brave men and women who work for us, and the public have trust in them, parliamentary oversight is very important. I'll let Stuart do the cyber one.
Larissa, I think there's two answers to your question. The impact is that any lessons which could have been learned will now be learned rather later than they ought to have been, perhaps too late to stop some other cyber attacks. But the other thing we need to learn from it is that what we have, and I said this in the opening remarks, is a ridiculously complex wiring diagram of responsibilities in relation to cyber alone. It's in the report, it's in paragraph 18. But just as an example, the Foreign Secretary has responsibility for the National Cyber Security Centre. The Defence Secretary has overall responsibility for offensive cyber and for the National Offensive Cyber Programme. The Secretary of State at DCMS leads on digital matters. The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster is responsible for the National Cyber Security Strategy. That's different to the National Centre for Cyber Security. This is ridiculous. So we probably should have learned a little sooner that this complex wiring diagram isn't fit for purpose either. So there are a number of lessons that went unlearned early enough.
Would you like one more question, Larissa?
Fine, thank you.
Thank you very much. In that case, we'll move to Paul
War of the Huffington Post. Paul.
It's a message for a question first for Kevin Jones. There's a key line in this report where you state it appears the intelligence community did learn the lessons from the American experience, and the British government recognised the Russian threat to the UK's democratic processes. In May 2017, the Joint Intelligence Committee concluded, had relevant parts of the intelligence community conducted a similar threat assessment prior to the Brexit referendum, it's inconceivable they would not have reached the same conclusions as to Russian intent, which might then have led them to take action to protect the process. Now, you've talked a lot about the UK government failures here, but to what extent are the intelligence agencies as well at fault here? Should they have waited for ministers to say, look, can we prepare for the Brexit referendum and the Russian threat, or should they have brought it actually amongst themselves, have actually done that anyway?
Well, there's a genuine nervousness in the security services about getting involved in the democratic process, and I think we all appreciate the reasons for that. But no, ultimately, this was a government decision, a ministerial decision, and short of getting a big flashing light outside number 10, this was going on. They couldn't have missed this. And it wasn't taken. So I think to sidestep and say blame the agencies is not fair, because I wouldn't want to live in a society where our security services are politically directed. That's going down a road which I don't think is very healthy for democracy, and also very healthy for a society I certainly want to live in. So no, the government have got to take responsibility for this. They can't sidestep it and blame other people. A decision was taken not to. The evidence was there from those, and that's the quote you've just given in the report is the conclusion we've come to. Stuart.
Paul, the quote you read out that if they'd done the same investigation, they'd have reached the same conclusions. That's really damning of the government. Subsequent failure not to undertake that investigation or assessment. You know, it's not that they didn't know by then what was going on in other parts of the world. And we still are left flummoxed as to understand why no one, as one of your colleagues asked earlier, lacked the curiosity to say, are we fully protected here? What's going on? And what more needs to be done to beef up, particularly the cyber defences?
Paul, come back.
Can I check more precisely who you think is to blame or is responsible within government? You keep saying, obviously, the UK government had some serious failures here. Are you talking about both the Cameron government in its dying days? Are you talking about the May government, and in particular, Foreign Secretary under Theresa May, Boris Johnson, for failing to grip this? Who are you talking about particularly, or all of them?
Well, you'll be aware that UK governments now have a penchant for talking about the whole of government approach, a joined up approach. Whether it's joined up or not is a matter for another time, but they talk about a whole of government approach. When it comes to national security, when it comes to cyber security, as I've just laid out, covering multiple departments, this should have been a cabinet decision. In one sense, whether it was Cameron or May or Johnston at the helm is almost irrelevant. The action required to be taken to assess and identify the threat and put in place the defences should have been undertaken by government with a decision made at a cabinet level, and that appears to us simply not to have happened.
One, you said it.
Paul,
Kevin was coming in.
Sorry, Paul. Can I just say, I concur with what Stuart said. Ultimately, the Prime Minister of the day, is responsible for how his or her government is conducted. And in terms of that decision and oversight, the responsibilities got to ultimately lie with them. If you want the Harry Truman, the book has to stop somewhere. Paul?
Final one to Stuart. He said earlier that you believe that ministers actively avoided checking into this whole matter. Do you have any evidence that they actively avoided it?
Sorry, I said quite the reverse. I was saying there was no active running. I thought I said there was no active running away from this, but nevertheless, no action was taken and it wasn't investigated.
I just want to clarify, the hot potato remark was about this issue that the press release makes very clear, which is about which of the agencies should take the lead in protecting our systems from threats of this sort. So that's really where we make a firm recommendation. And in a way, it's commendable that the intelligence services are reluctant to get in too close to the party political process and the electoral process, but somebody has to protect them and somebody has to take lead responsibility, and the report clearly makes recommendations. Just want to get that on the record. So we now come to Ben Glaze of the Mirror.
Thank you, yes. Could you what exactly you think Russia obviously seeks to gain from this campaign of interference in our politics? And given what's in your report, is there any reason Russia wouldn't have tried to interfere in the 2016 Brexit referendum?
Well, Ben, you just need to read the open source material. They have form in this area. And as the report says, it takes a number of different approaches, whether it be the influence event in terms of fake news that has been highlighted in the report, but also amplifying, and that's aimed really at amplifying already existing divisions within electoral systems. What is it to be gained from it? Well, I think it's to disorientate what it sees as one of its adversaries, and There's obviously, in terms of the hack and leak of the both in the United States and France, was a way of doing that. In terms of influence, yeah, the ultimate thing is to weaken us in terms of democracy like our own. We are open and free in terms of difference of opinions. They clearly seek to amplify those divisions, which leads possibly to destabilising the system, which is what they're aiming to do.
Well, I said in my introductory remarks, sorry, Ben, I said in my introductory remarks, it carries out certain cyber activity in order to assert itself. It does attempt to interfere in other countries' elections. It does pre-position itself in other countries' critical national infrastructure, because it's not just about picking a fight with a traditional adversary or an enemy. It's about positioning itself as a resurgent great power. We mustn't understand the motivation behind many of the things which it does.
Would you like to follow up, Ben?
What role you see for social media companies in curbing the spread of disinformation from Russia? What more they can do?
Well, I think the main one is taking misinformation down as quickly as possible, and this is, I think, already been pursued by DCMS, but it needs to be timely and taken down. The other, I think, role which is mentioned in the report, which government can play, is when there is clear evidence of any state actor, using social media in this way, we should name them and shame them. But also, I think the recommendation is that is the same around social media, where if they refuse to take what are clearly designed to interfere in our system, they should be named and shamed as well.
Very good. Would you like a third to go, Ben? Very good. We'll move on then to Alex Hudson of Newsweek, please.
Hello. Given the lack of evidence gathering around in the 2019 election, you've talked a lot about future election processes, and your language around proof and evidence is very, very carefully worded. How much more are you expecting to gain if we look into the 2029 election interference, given that those questions weren't asked at the time?
If you look at what the government said in the written ministerial statement last week, they said, after an analysis, the government has concluded it's almost certain Russian actors sought to interfere in the 2019 general election through the online amplification of illicitly acquired and leaked government documents. And it goes on in that vein. So this committee will undertake to, or the new committee will undertake to seek further inquiries into this to actually see the evidence, the intelligence that would stand this up. At which point we'll be able to answer the question much more clearly. Was the interference widespread? Did it simply take a few dodgy documents and amplify them? Did it seek or achieve in changing how people voted, although that's unlikely? Only after we begin to see some of the intelligence behind the government statement and other information, we'll be able to answer fully the question about the scale and scope of the interference that you're asking.
Thanks, Alex. We as a committee have access to access to request the classified information behind this WMS. We've done that. We've asked for that, but we're a bit limited in the sense that at this time we can't really say a great deal more than is in the public domain, because we've actually not seen any of the classified material which the government used to come to this conclusion. Likewise, we've not also seen any classified information about any wider involvement or alleged involvement in the 2019 general election. As Stuart just said, once we see that classified information, then we could make a judgment on that WMS. But as I said, I think earlier on, it did come as a little surprise to I think a number of the members of the committee that this WMS came out the week before this Russia report was being. But we will assess it once we get the intelligence and make a view. But we can't really say anything more because we haven't seen it.
That the evidence will be much better this time compared to the previous times and the evidence that you have looked through.
Well, if they look for someone provided to us, we'll be delighted, because the whole point and the whole theme of this is they did not seek evidence on interference in previous political or democratic events. Therein lies the fundamental problem. So, self-evidently, if they've sought evidence and provided this time, that will be 100% better than the very limited or non-existent effort that was put in historically.
Says is that you know, if we have had a change in government, that somehow they're now looking for evidence for interfering in elections, that's a good move. But again, we haven't seen the intelligence around this particular WMS. And the more important thing is not just this thing that was put in, the reasons why it was put in the public domain last week, as I say, I'm a bit sceptical of. But is there a wider investigation into other things? We as a committee have not been informed of that prior to. And as I say, the first we heard of this last week was when we received the WMS on Thursday morning.
Would you like to come back further?
Hey, given Mike Pompeo is in the UK today, and he's very keenly focused on China, and he's met with China hawks this morning, we believe. Do you think that this work on Russia has actually fallen down the priority list for governments, particularly in diplomatic relationships overseas, particularly with the US, because of recent political focus on China and Hong Kong? And how are you hoping that this report will bring it back to the top of the agenda?
Well, the fact that we've got journalist after journalist speaking about it today, that this report has been much awaited, and I don't think lets people down. This is not out of date. I think this brings Russia back up the political and diplomatic agenda, as it should do, and that's not to take any focus off of China at all, of course, but sometimes governments need to think about more than one thing simultaneously, particularly when it comes to important foreign affairs matters.
Yeah, I mean, China's got a lot of attention in the last few months, certainly within Parliament. One could ask why similar questions aren't being asked around Russia's involvement. And I think the point I would make is that I think the Russian ambassador said the weekend that he wants good relationships with the UK. I personally would agree with that. I think most people would agree with that. But that can only be achieved if Russia applies, and works by the international rules-based order which we all accept. And I think without that, Russia continues to be a threat to the UK. And this is why it's remarkable that the government haven't looked at what involvement they've had in terms of previous elections, apart from, say, the late WMS last week on the 2019 general election.
Thank you very much, Alex. And before you leave us, I'd just like to point out for the record that I'm sure with regard to the issuing of the written ministerial statement, the government would undoubtedly say that they briefed the new committee at the first opportunity, so soon after it had been formed. The trouble is, of course, the committee should have been formed a lot earlier. So our final questioner is Torkel Kristen from the Daily Record. Torkel.
Hi, good morning. I hope you can hear me. What's fascinating here is that the warning lights were flashing on the dashboard of democracy in 2014 during the Scottish independence referendum. You refer to open source material on that. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that and whether the committee itself investigated these allegations. How did the UK government miss this? This is meant to be the gold standard of referendum. And do the findings, or your findings, that Russia did interfere in 2014 amount to an acceptance that it is in Russia's interests to break up the United Kingdom?
Firstly, the report, and this is on page 13, talks about the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, so that's there. And there is a very clear footnote on that page, which I'll read for clarity, Torkel. It says, it was widely reported shortly after the referendum that Russian election observers had suggested there were irregularities in the conduct of the vote, and that this position was being widely pushed by Russian state media. We understand the UK government viewed this as primarily aimed at discrediting the UK in the eyes of a domestic Russian audience, but nevertheless, those messages post-referendum were being put out there to discredit the results. So you're absolutely right. That was a warning light. There were subsequent ones, the 2016 DNC, hack and leak, the En Marché in France, and it wasn't the case that the government weren't told they should be looking at this. On page 14, again, this is in a footnote, but I'm sure you'll avidly read it over the next few days, the DCMS Select Committee called on the government to launch an independent investigation into foreign influence, disinformation funding, voter manipulation and the sharing of data in relation to the Scottish independence referendum. So the government were told by a select committee of the House, not us, but another select committee, to undertake precisely the work that would have identified the scale and scope of this threat.
As I said, I don't. Sorry.
We've got Kevin yet.
Yeah.
Because your report says that there are agents, that there are...
Sorry, will you stop, please? I'm sorry, will you stop? We've got Kevin to reply first. Okay, I'll call you in, don't worry.
Yeah. No, as Stuart said, all the evidence was there from the Scottish referendum. You know, short of having a large van outside Downing Street with a billboard on it saying this is what was going on, what more did the government need? And it does raise the question is, why the decision was taken not to look at the referendum. And, I think the report quite rightly draws comparison to what happened in the United States, where, investigations did take place into the leaking. Here, that decision wasn't taken.
Right. Here you go.
Sorry to cut across you there, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Jones, but I was interested in what Stuart said, because the report says that there are people who've played a role wittingly or unwittingly and formed a buffer of Westerners who are de facto agents of the Russian state. Now, do you include the Edinburgh-based Sputnik press agency in this, Russia Today, and particularly your former colleague, Stuart, Alex Salmond? Is he a de facto agent of the Russian state?
The reference to de facto agents and the buffer was in relation to enablers, accountants, lawyers, estate agents, people who do company formation, wittingly or unwittingly, for people close to the Russian state. We make an explicit criticism of, we actually say that there was, in the run-up to the EU referendum, a preponderance of anti-EU, pro-Brexit pieces on RT and Sputnik. What the report does not do is make any criticism of any individual programme maker or commentator or presenter. That's not what this is about. It's about RT and Sputnik as institutions who are able very quickly when they need to get out the Russian state version of events. It's not a criticism of any particular individual at all. And I don't think it can be much clearer than that, Torkel.
Right, Torkel. One more go if you want it.
Can't hear you.
Can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Just in general, your report talks about this being the new normal, Russian interference in Western democracy. So just in a few words, how would you summarize the threat of Russia to Western democracy? Is it just a nuisance we're going to have to live with? Is it a serious threat? Or should voters really be worried about the electoral process being undermined by Russia?
I think we describe it as a new normal. It is part of their strategy, and I think what we need to do is make sure that we've got policies in place which protects our democratic process. And I think uniquely in the UK, because of a paper-based voting system, it makes it harder to actually attack that side of it. But one of the great strengths would have been actually doing the investigation, because if the government had done that, at least then it could have looked for vulnerabilities, looked for things, and been able to change them. It chose not to do that.
Thank you, Torquil. We have a late addition to our list, and it's the final one, I believe. Paul Brand from ITV.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair, for allowing this late submission. It's very much appreciated. Just coming back and sort of summarising this press conference, fundamentally, do you believe that the government has been reluctant to look at Russian interference in the Brexit referendum because the government is run by the winning side?
No, that's a very political question, which I don't think we can answer. All we can say, and all the report says, is that they didn't seek the information. That's the real shock in this. The kind of political subterfuge that might be dreadfully interesting in, the tea rooms of the House of Commons is irrelevant. The fact is they did not seek to understand the impact or scale or scope of the interference in previous political events, including the EU referendum. They should now do that so that we can understand what it entailed, what impact it may or may not have had, what influence it may or may not have had, and to work out how to protect the efficacy of the democratic process going forward.
It's not for this committee. It's not for this committee to make a political judgment on that. It's for others, if they want to draw their own conclusions, entirely up to them. But what we were tasked with, as I keep saying, unique access to material which is not in the public domain. We were able to look at what was, or in this case, was not done. And I think the really serious issue that this report puts forward is that, as I said earlier on, democracy is a very precious thing, which I think the report refers to. We need to do what we can to protect it, and the government has not done that. And that's why we suggest, as a matter of urgency, it is looked at, because we're not dealing here with an adversary who is going to go away soon. Why ministers chose not to do that and actually learn the lessons and possibly, if necessary, change things, that's one you've got to address to them.
Well, that is the end of what has been a lengthy news conference by the new Intelligence and Security Committee. Julian Lewis not taking any part. The substance of it is that this report has now been published, 47 pages on Russian influence. The government's already put out its own 20-page response to that. That may be because they don't think there'll be time for a parliamentary discussion of the matter before the House rises tomorrow. But we've also had a tweet accompanying that from the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, who says, we've been clear that Russia must desist from its attacks on the UK and our allies. We will be resolute in defending our country, our democracy and our values from such hostile state activity. And he then refers to the report. As far as the report itself is concerned, the main thrust of it is that it says after the experience of the 2014 referendum in Scotland, it basically says the security services and the government under successive Prime Ministers, David Cameron, Theresa May and Boris Johnson, were not really curious about Russian involvement. And we just heard that in those final questions. They complained that MI5, when asked about Russian involvement, initially provided just 6 lines of text. Agencies thought that there might be any role in relation to the UK's democratic processes, and particularly one as contentious as the EU referendum, but they didn't look into it. The report says, we repeat that this attitude is illogical. This is about the protection of the process and mechanism for hostile state interference, which should fall to our intelligence and security agencies. So an element of blame there, although, as you heard, they're not ascribing motive. And just one line I can quote from the government response, which I haven't been through completely. They say, we have seen no evidence of successful interference in the EU referendum, which somewhat begs the question as a denial. Well, let's speak now to our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, who's been looking both at that news conference and the government response. Sam.
So really, this report, I think, raises two big questions. The first is around whether or not ministers, and to a certain degree the intelligence agencies, dropped the ball on the question of Russian interference, given what the report suggests was pretty unambiguous attempts by Russia to interfere in the Scottish independence referendum, which took place in September 2014. So first of all, it ascribes blame essentially to the David Cameron regime between 2014 and June 2016, when the Brexit referendum took place, for failing to really realise that the UK democratic system had been provenly under threat from the behaviour of Russian outfits in 2014. And it asks why that was the case. Then, once the Brexit referendum was out of the way, Theresa May was Prime Minister, it says that the UK government's line was that it saw no successful attempt of interference by Russia in the Brexit referendum. But the main reason for that is that it had never asked the question. It had evidence from 2014, but by then, in the summer of 2016, you had that extraordinary leak of Democratic Party emails, internal correspondence between different US Democratic Party operatives that flooded over the internet, ascribed to Russia. Even in the light of that, there was no curiosity, it would appear, amongst ministers whether or not there was any interference in the UK process in June 2016 in the Brexit referendum. So I think that will be one big question from this report. As you say, the UK government have just published their response on that. Not only did they say that there's no evidence of successful interference in the EU referendum. Note that word successful. Time and again in that press conference, the panel made clear that it's impossible to say what's successful interference and what actually changes the outcome. You can only say that there was interference or not, and denied that there was no lessons learned exercise afterwards, saying that they regularly review the intelligence threat. Second big area, the suggestion that over the course of 25 years, London has become the centre for Russian influence, Russian money, and Russian leaning on the UK political system. They talk about the London laundromat, prominent Russian individuals aided by PR men, lawyers, accountants and others who create a mini Russia outside who can then influence the political system.
OK, Sam Coates, thank you very much indeed. Should just explain why during that news conference the name of the former First Minister of Scotland, Alex Salmond, came up. That's because RT and Sputnik, Russian news organisations, are named in the report, and Alex Salmond did present a programme on RT for a period. Well, let's go now to the chairman of the committee when it drew up the report, Dominic Grieve, the former Attorney General, who joins me now. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Mr. Grieve, we see no evidence of successful interference in the EU referendum. That's the government statement. Does that end the matter as far as you're concerned?
The point that we made in our report is that nobody looked to see if there was Russian interference. And frankly, from the evidence that we saw at the time, nobody has been looking since in a focused way as to whether it happened or not. So one of the aims of this report, and I want to emphasise it wasn't just about electoral interference in electoral processes, was whether we could answer that question and provide reassurance to the public that there hadn't been, or if there had been, that it had been stopped in some way. We weren't able to do that. And the reality, I think, is that perhaps for understandable reasons, our security services regard democratic processes as an area in which they themselves don't wish to be seen to be meddling for obvious reasons. They have a high reputation for their impartiality. But this is actually a threat to our democracy. And actually, part of MI5's remit is to protect our democracy from being subverted. So there has to be more focus than that, and I'm very sorry that it hasn't taken place when there were clear signs from 2014 onwards that this was a new form of Russian activity, particularly using the internet.
And who is to blame for that question not being asked by the security services or reported to politicians?
Well, I think it is actually ultimately a matter of political leadership. This is a delicate subject. But if there is a clear bipartisan desire, which I think there would be, between all the major political parties, that the protection of our democratic processes is vital to maintain public confidence in democracy and its institutions, then I think that the security service and the other agencies would feel perfectly able to monitor this far more closely. And indeed, it appears from what the government said about the 2019 election that that has happened. But we were seeking to answer some questions back in 2018 relating to the Scottish referendum and the 2016 referendum and electoral processes generally, and we found ourselves in great difficulty because we couldn't answer the question that we'd set out to ask.
So, effectively, the people to blame for obstruction by omission, if you like, are David Cameron, Theresa May and Boris Johnson.
Well, I think that's to slightly personalise it. I think I would simply say that somebody took their eye off the ball or didn't actually ever put their eye on the ball in the first place and simply assumed that this wasn't an issue. I think it is an issue, and indeed the evidence since, in terms of interference in other countries, whether it's the United States or France, makes abundantly clear that this is a very serious issue.
Do you think that was because there was reluctance to question the winning side in the referendum?
I've no idea, and I wouldn't wish to speculate on that one way or another. But clearly, simply saying, oh, well, that's in the past, so we can forget about it, I don't think is an adequate response. And even now, I think there should be a much fuller investigation into whether Russia did interfere, particularly through internet use, which appears to be their classic method, in the 2016 referendum. But I'm not attributing blame to any individual. I wouldn't wish to do so.
OK, Dominic Grieve, former chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee, thank you very much indeed